Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this panel session. I'm George McBride. I'm one of the co-founders at Clerkenwell Health, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer there. I'm going to be chairing a panel today entitled Atlantic Psychedelics, From Discovery to Delivery. What we'll be talking about is a range of challenges that drug developers of psychedelic treatments face, right from manufacturing and moving Schedule I compounds through to the preclinical activities and then conducting clinical research in order to try and move some of these treatments through to marketing authorization. I will try and do less of the talking because I have a lot less expertise to bring to this conversation than my friends on the panel, but not speaking isn't something I do very well, so we'll see how that goes. Yeah, so if everyone could introduce themselves first, that would be a useful place to start. In order, after you, Nick.
Sure. I'm Nick Kadysh. I'm the founder of PharmAla Biotech. We're an MDMA company, so we manufacture GMP MDMA, most of which goes to clinical trial use, but some of which is now going to the commercial market in Australia. And then we research and develop novel analogs of MDMA.
I'm Guy Higgins. I'm the CSO of Transpharmation. We're a preclinical CRO. We work across multiple areas of neuroscience, but we've been pretty active in the psychedelics field, working with both lead optimization and some translational aspects to new psychedelics.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm a co-founder, CEO of Eramol. I'm also a qualified person. So Eramol is a contract manufacturer based in the UK and in Dublin, and we manufacture and deal with primary manufacturing, packaging, labeling, and distribution, and that includes psychedelics. And we've worked with multiple companies in moving these compounds from UK to EU to US, Australia. So yeah, that'll be my perspective today.
Hi everyone, I'm Clare Knight. I'm the Senior Clinical Trial Manager at Clerkenwell Health, and we are a specialist CRO and site network focusing in the first instance on delivering clinical trials using psychedelic compounds, but moving more generally into mental health and CNS trial delivery.
Thank you, everyone. So I might start with you, Nick, because you're the person who has to deal with all of us in this situation. And part of what we want to do in this panel is shed some light on the challenges that drug developers working with these compounds face and how you get around them. So what have you found the most challenging bit as you've been putting together your drug development program? Because we've got people here from manufacturing, preclinical, clinical. Where are you facing the most challenges and what are you seeing?
I mean, look, my bias is always regulatory because that's my background. But I think it is the challenge for all of us. It increases costs. It increases timelines incredibly. There's a highly regulated subset of an already highly regulated space. And so if you're dealing in controlled substances, which unfortunately all of us are, yes, for some of us, I think that provides some business opportunities, I think for all of us, frankly, but it certainly makes life a lot more difficult.
So what do you look for when you're looking for a partner to deal with some of these tricky regulatory issues? Because I know there have been mixed sentiments towards how incumbent companies have been able to deal with the unique challenges of developing psychedelic compounds.
Number one, we look for long-term partners. So, I think there's been a lot of sort of jumping around. It's a new sector, new industry. People are sort of finding their feet, but we've been working with the same sort of preclinical partners for our entire lifespan as a company. We like to find people that we can work with for a long time, and that is a challenge, frankly, because some of the people that we probably started working with may no longer exist anymore. And unfortunately, due to the nature of the economic climate, I think that's going to be a problem for all of us for a little while now.
And moving on to some of the real world challenges you faced, how How difficult have you found it as you've set up both your drug development program and your MDMA supply line to move these compounds around the world internationally?
It's hard. No, look, it's hard. It's not impossible, unfortunately. So every jurisdiction has its sort of pluses and minuses. So I think import and export out of the U.S. is relatively simple, but they have this global quota system. So if you manufacture there, it's very, very challenging. Mindset Pharma, which is a partner organization for some of us here, have faced extraordinary challenges manufacturing psilocybin in the U.S. So I'm growing to love Australia more and more and more for a whole host of reasons. But one of them is actually Australia makes import-export quite easy, as does, I think, the UK. But Canada's very challenging.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, the UK Home Office does get a bit of a bad rap sometimes, and they, for all their faults, are at least gone digital. Digital permits, where Australia, it's still paper-based, so that takes extra days. And I think the other challenge you face, certainly in the EU, it's a single market, so there's no customs checks, but there are import-export permits even in with the EU. So 5-MeO, for example, not controlled in France, not controlled in Czech Republic, but controlled pretty much everywhere else. So you have to, in terms of overcoming that challenge, if you're looking at broader global studies, is looking at, okay, what territories will I get my patients recruited into, and then what the classification there is. And that's even before you start thinking about your clinical trial authorization in that territory. So I think it's choosing your partner right, getting the right regulatory advice as early on as you can from regulatory consultants and the rest of it, but also from the CMC element as well, from people like myself with QPs or release sites where they can give you that advice right early on.
So what have been some of the biggest mistakes you've seen people making in trying to facilitate speedy movement of Schedule 1 compounds?
Thinking they can just ship a product back to the States without any permit, or because it's a return, an IMP return from a site. Oh, it's only a return, it can go back. So that's a tricky one. Some of the challenges as well, we may come on to is your shelf life. How long have you got an expiry date of a new compound, early phase or phase 2? 6, 12 months, by the time you make it and you get your local regulatory approvals and then your import-export permits, that can eat easily half into that. So have a plan for the sites that they can maybe perform by extensions. Have you got a plan for that? So yeah, not having a plan, I think, is ultimately where you potentially end up once you move a Schedule 1 into Australia, for example, and it's in the sites and they can't return or can't easily return it, it goes out of date. It's wasted stock that's in that territory.
In terms of import-export, I'll tell a very brief, humorous story. It wasn't funny for us at the time. We had an export permit for 300 grams of MDMA. It's quite a large shipment. And it was, we were pushing our contractor to get it out. On the last day, it goes out. At the site, some guy put the properly labeled box into another box. Airline says no, export permit expires, import permit expires. That's another 3 months, guys. That's for a box.
Put your stuff in the right box.
Put your stuff in the right box, that's correct.
Moral of the story. And so once, people have actually managed to manufacture their compound and get it to the country they need it to start doing some work, I will move to you, Guy. What are your clients looking for while they're doing preclinical work in animals, and what kind of indications can you get, and how does it differ from the work you do with non-psychedelic, non-psychoactive compounds?
Okay, there's quite a lot in that question. Take the first part. I would divide what you can do with animals in the drug discovery process into 3 steps. You've got the target validation step. Well, to some extent, I think with psychedelics, that's pretty well covered. 2A agonism is associated, if you're talking about high dose psilocybin, for example, psychedelic state your target is accepted. Second one is lead optimization, and we're quite heavily involved in that. So if someone's working with an array of, say, psilocybin analogues, how do you go about, picking those out beyond the initial receptor screening? That tends to be based more around activities such as the PK property, oral bioavailability. That would be an obvious one. Another thing is that clients are interested in the duration of the psychedelic state. And so how do you try and address that? And so we've been doing quite a lot of work around drug discrimination, actually, which we find has quite a nice PK-PD relationship. And we've used that as an approach to actually look in conjunction with the PK properties of a drug for the duration of the state. And then you've got the third aspect, which is then translating, how can you use that data to help guide, the clinical phase? Because of course, once you get into toxicologists love to find negative things with your drug, right? They'll go high enough. If you go up to 100 milligrams per kilogram psilocybin, you'll see abnormal EEG, you'll see serotonin syndrome. Now, of course, those signs have to be put in the context of efficacy. That's how you can assess, the potential of your drug. And what we're finding is that something like drug discrimination, you can actually look at exposures. So if I talk about a specific example, train rats, psilocybin, 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, the blood levels on that generalization curve, they're around 2 to 10 nanograms per ml. Well, that corresponds to a sort of mild perceptual state, I believe, in humans. So that's you can then use that along with how do other known psychedelics like LSD, DMT, and so forth. If you can build that relationship and it holds, then you can look at novel drugs and see, well, how do they sit, in terms of their dose response, their generalization curve, and corresponding exposure. So that can sort of help guide the clinical phase, the translatability. I'm quite, I've worked in animal model. Most of my background is pharma. I mean, very much come from robustness. And so I always think it's a danger to overstretch what animal models can actually tell you. So I think, there's a risk in saying, well, I think this might be better for, say, anorexia nervosa and this one for depression. I think if you're looking at high-dose psychedelic dosing, what you can do on the animal model side is say, okay, well, does it produce a psilocybin? If you're looking at generalization to psilocybin, we also do corresponding things with 5-methoxy. Does it generalize? At what doses and at what exposures? I think that tells you, okay, well, there's probably a good chance when you go to human that you've got a good chance that the drug will do something similar to human. So I wouldn't sort of go beyond that. Microdosing, low dose is a little bit different, because there you're looking at more chronic treatments, and that's more the traditional way of looking at drugs. In my experience, of course, the big difference with macrodosing is the disconnect between the PK and the efficacy effect.
So I imagine most of these novel sort of second, third gen psychedelics that you're working with probably haven't hit the clinic yet. The vast majority probably never will, I would imagine as well. There's quite a high degree of attrition. But I'm going to move over to Clare because assuming the rare few drug developers have managed to surmount all of these obstacles in terms of discovering some compounds, choosing their lead, getting it into country and getting it ready for clinical trial, the work has only really just begun, hasn't it? And as Guy just said, there's still a lot of unknowns in how those drugs are going to work in humans. So what are the biggest challenges you see while you're designing and delivering clinical research for clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd start by absolutely echoing Nick and Peter's comments that the first and foremost, it's about the kind of regulatory frameworks that we're operating in. Certainly clinical trials of investigational products are very complicated pieces of work to put together, and when you put those additional layers of complexity and regulation around controlled drugs, as you mentioned, that becomes kind of increasingly difficult. It becomes more time consuming, it's more costly for drug developers. You know, you really are extending those kind of typical lead times that it might take to get a trial designed and approved. And I think then you're looking at the fact that if you're working across jurisdictions, which many people want to, there's real variation and nuance and differences between those regulatory frameworks, and it's very challenging to navigate exactly what those nuances might look like, how you might have to address those in terms of your trial applications and designs to make those fit those different areas. And of course then, on top of that, until very, very recently, we've been doing that with no guidance. So actually, that means when we're putting our applications for trials together, we're actually working with the regulators at a very early stage, so early engagement, scientific advice meetings, pre-IND meetings, etc., which takes, can really kind of double the length of time that you would typically expect to put an application together. You then might be spending more time in kind of communication between the submission of a trial and the authorization of a trial, because again, you're kind of working with the regulators. They're asking you for things in real time, and we haven't had a really robust framework of expectation of what these should look like. But I think once you get to the point of a trial actually being approved and being ready to be delivered, probably the main pinch point then is just a lack of kind of really experienced delivery infrastructure. So there's still a real shortage of sites that are able to host these types of trials. A lack of kind of expertise, I think, in really understanding some of the operational challenges of delivering these trials. I've worked in psychiatry research most of my career, and psychiatry trials alone are a different beast to other areas of medicine. There's a whole set of considerations that perhaps don't exist in other areas of medicine. And again, we're just adding another layer on top of that when we're looking at vulnerable populations and substances that may cause people to have a change in their perception, and we have to be thinking about those ethical challenges. And then kind of beyond and on top of that, really, we're sort of seeing that we're in the early days of delivering these trials, and operationally, even at the most granular level, there's challenges associated with those that can really limit the throughput of people in trials. I think we'll probably touch later on issues such as kind of recruitment and eligibility criteria, but kind of before then, just understanding what is required to be able to kind of deliver a protocol.
Just to add as well, from regulatory requirements, they change. So, you know, you may have an idea for a study today. In 12 months, 24 months, you know, the European clinical trial regulations is now in force, different application process. UK's starting to drift away. I won't mention the B word, but that, you know, is starting to look at their own independent. Example, Australia as well, now Schedule 1, I believe there's a patient registry that needs to be done for Schedule 1 psychedelics, hallucinogenics. So it's constantly changing, constantly evolving. Goalposts are moving, shifting. Compounds that are not classified today then become classified mainly because there's more activity in said compound. So keeping abreast and horizon scanning of what the upcoming changes and the impact to your study design and supply chain is key.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, okay. So Claire, the FDA just published a guidance, right, for psychedelic clinical trials. I think first major regulator to publish a specific guidance. Does that now sort of become the industry standard outside of the United States because otherwise, like there are no other sort of published standards like that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's certainly a template. I think it's important that for the first time we do have something in writing that we can work towards. But as we said, the nuances between different kind of jurisdictions are still there. So I think we should use that as a kind of good starting point. I think we do need to develop more kind of robust guidelines for each jurisdiction, and perhaps some things that can work across areas that are sort of just key principles. But certainly, I think it's a good starting point. How that will translate into making trials kind of more approvable or more streamlined in terms of navigating that process, I think is kind of yet to be seen.
It's an evolving beast, and the theme that I'm pulling out from a lot of what everyone's been saying is uncertainty, regulatory hurdles, and delays seems to be the main recurring interlinked themes and the problems here. A trial, when you're just conceiving of it, by the time you end up delivering it, is going to be delivered in a very different environment with different regulations, different guidelines, and that means everything's probably going to go wildly off timeline and budget. So how do we all work together with one another to bring things back and stop trials just shifting and morphing and changing and running out of money along the way?
In addition to my work at PharmAla, I'm the board chair of our trade association in Canada, Psychedelics Canada. And that has helped. So, in Canada, we have a critical mass of psychedelics companies for a whole host of mostly historical reasons relating to cannabis and our fairly lax capital markets. And so, we're organized. We go to government together. Last week, they announced a $3 million grant through the Canadian Institutes for Health Research for clinical research into psilocybin. And that was a direct result of our lobbying work there. We engage on regulatory issues all the time. So, look, if you want government to stop dicking you around, you have to tell them so. And if you tell them so by yourself, they're probably not going to listen. But if you come as a group, you might have some success.
I think planning as best you can. I think if you're looking at single territories, if you're looking at UK on its own, that getting product in, I think, as Nick said, is fairly straightforward. We don't need to name individual compounds on Schedule 1 Home Office license, where other countries, such as the US and Australia, you do. Getting a single territory trial early phase, that isn't too bad. The minute you start opening up to potentially phase 2, 2A, 2B, phase 3, where you're going global, having, ideally you'd have a manufacturer API, manufacturer drug substance, drug products in every territory, but that's not feasible, not going to happen. So you're going to have to move these compounds around, and that's where the delays and unknowns come in.
Yeah, if I had to tell you the number of times that some company has called us or some researcher and said, hey, we need like 80 grams of MDMA and we need it tomorrow, no.
I bet those calls won't stop happening, though. The more of that will happen. Another thing that's coming out from our discussion is around collaboration. I know in other more well-established areas of clinical research, you can pretty much leave vendors to just get on with their part and assume that things will run fairly to plan, considering you have quite extensive plans. But in this field, I think it takes a lot more time in building relationships among the different parties who are delivering this work so that they're sharing knowledge as things progress. Anyone got any thoughts about how to improve collaboration? You've built a trade group or are representing the trade group in Canada to help collaboration. We at Clerkenwell are working to bring the right partners in and spend a lot of time working with our partners to make sure that everything's clear. And that is probably the main bit of our job, is just orchestrating different parties. But Guy, Peter, any thoughts about how collaboration in this field could improve?
I think from my own perspective, when you're in the contract research space, there's a variety of different groups that you work with, and one or two companies, such as Mindset, we work very closely with, and there's very much a sort of open dialogue about how the behavior, how the animal data can translate and help guide the early clinical program. So, you know, that's probably the obvious thing. We don't really collaborate amongst other CROs. That's
obviously the Psych Congress, but I think sometimes we deal with, or we have requests from new startups that are outside of the UK or EU jurisdiction, and they just perhaps don't have the awareness, I think, of what's needed to move product, to get a CTA submission in, to write an IMPD, the grade of API they need. So I think a kind of education awareness of the challenges faced with psychedelics and other clinical trial material for new startups is probably really, really important.
Yeah, I think I just kind of add to that, in that I think engaging with your collaborators at the earlier stage is really, really critical. What doesn't work is us each doing our bits in silos. It's important to be talking to your partners kind of before you're working on a protocol. I think, you know, Peter and I have had many times that we've spoken quite early on, and actually you build those things together because you have an appreciation and understanding of each other's timelines and the dependencies on each other, and you can mitigate for that in your design and your applications. And that's kind of actually, for me, one of the most interesting, exciting things about this space, because that's very different to how you normally do medical research, where everyone just kind of does their bit in their box and it all sort of joins together in the end. But, you know, we work in a very fast-paced, as we said, constantly evolving space, and we kind of rely on communicating with each other to make it work.
I think as a contract manufacturer, my staff are really interested in manufacturing these types of compounds, because there's something different from a standard, you know, heart tablet or a placebo to match. So I think, you know, that really helps staff. Then they buy into what they're trying to do with this compound, and they love hearing feedback from the clinic if it's gone well, or just, you know, what was the trip like? You know, that's the common question that sometimes we don't always know. Certainly if it's, you know, double-blinded, we're not going to know, but, well, you'll know, but not officially. So that's quite interesting from our side. You know, what the science behind it is always, you know, really exciting. As a pharmacist, you know, back in the day, I'd find that fascinating, just to have new treatments or new options for treatments, certainly in TRD, where you've got nothing for 50 years.
I just want to go back to George saying that that in other areas, like, you can just let vendors get on with it and do their jobs. That has not been my experience, George. Spoken like a vendor.
No, but I think it's even more pronounced in this field. I think one of the things that we all enjoy but find very challenging is just the amount of communication and interpersonal, work that goes into these trials, from design to delivery. You're on the phone or in meetings all day for months, and it can get exhausting, but it's also, I think, part of what I like about working in the sector. You're working with people who are excited and talented, moving into a new field and trying to do things differently in what is quite a constrained system, clinical research. There's only degrees in which you can push boundaries. There is a good reason why a lot of things just have to be done the way they have to be done.
I think it's exciting because we're dealing with smaller companies. I think once big pharma get involved, it might become a bit more bureaucratic.
Yeah, for sure. I think it could probably benefit from some of their cash and some of their processes as well, though. So we will see how that goes. I think we're moving towards the end of our time, so I think we've got some time for some questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Anyone developing any of these compounds and interested? Yes, up there at the back. Do I have a roaming mic? Is there somebody who can facilitate questions? Thank you. Sorry, I chose the furthest away person I could find.
I have a tool. Brilliant.
Who was asking? Not me.
Thanks. Yeah, as somebody who's been involved in controlled substance active ingredients for coming up for 25 years, shipping these products globally, I find it personally easier for psychedelics than it is for something like, I would say, cannabinoids, because it's very crystal clear as to how they are scheduled. But I think one of the difficulties is when they are Schedule 1 products, specifically when it comes to clinical trial design and location for clinical trials, having them as Schedule 1 really reduces the availability of available sites that can handle these types of products globally. And I think there's a very strong case for these products to be rescheduled to Schedule 2. You know, they have therapeutic value. It's been proven there's therapeutic value. But I think, having spoken with Nick a few times today, it's really important for companies to partner with suppliers who understand the market, who are planning in this for the long term, and have the relationships with the authorities over a long period of time to be able to do that. And I think, you know, working with an API partner who can justify stability programs and have them under ICH programs to then get to the point of where you're running out of retest. As long as you've got that program, you can then re-extend and re-extend as you develop your program. But yeah, it was just really to talk about the movement of these products. From my perspective, having been in the industry for 25 years, it's much easier than working in cannabis and cannabinoids, because it's very, very clear and there's no ambiguity about it.
Thank you very much. So, if any of the panel worked, I came from cannabis, as a lot of people did, into this. Well, I kind of started in psychedelics and then cannabis and then back. But I would agree, and cannabis seems to, as certainly in its raw herbal form, to cause more complexity and issues with movement. Have any of you had any experiences? Is this the easier end of controlled drugs, or are we at the harder end?
I'll just speak from a Canadian experience, because of course it was legalised, but the government was actually quite slow in changing the regulate. Preclinically, we still needed licensing for it, and they were slow in putting that in process. So it was actually it was a protracted process for us to eventually get a site license to work with cannabis, which kind of seemed a bit ironic given, you know, Canada's liberal attitude to. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from the UK perspective, importing CBD and then importing synthetic CBD, so where there's virtually undetectable amounts of THC, that caused quite a bit of problems initially from a Home Office import permit, but you know, that's overcome and seen less of it now. So.
Yeah, but then we're still seeing issues. I've saw there's all sorts of stuff going on with CBD still getting stuck everywhere all over the world. So it's not by no means over. And Guy, I think that's a fairly common experience. I don't think drug prohibition didn't do much to stop people accessing drugs for recreational purposes. It did a hell of a lot to stifle research.
Yes.
It wasn't a very effective tool at that. It was very effective in shutting down research.
Yeah, it was quite a frustrating period, because I think all of these things, there's a wave, you know, and there was a big interest in both THC and CBD type derivatives, and it was problematic for us to actually access the necessary license to do the work. You know, and so you're getting in just as the wave is beginning to decline, you know, it's...
Well, thankfully, from where we all started, there is a nice change now. There are people who can sell you MDMA in Australia. There are people with licensed clinics in West London. Lots of work going on third-generation psychedelic compounds and animal models, and Peter moving drugs internationally from... the southeast of England. So there are now people who can do this stuff, is one of the main takeaways that I would like to draw from this session. Things have changed.
Yeah, and look, I think if we are successful in doing all the things that we're doing, right, like providing clinical evidence and, you know, pushing governments to change regulations, I actually think that unfortunately, or maybe for the better, like things will get murkier. Like we have a rescheduling now in Australia. There will be a time in like the very near future where you will probably need like an export permit, but maybe not an import permit for certain jurisdictions. And one of the best opportunities I see in the very near future is there are jurisdictions like Australia now where we don't have to do a formal clinical trial anymore. We can look at data observationally now because there's actually going to be patients treated. So you know, all of this stuff will actually, I think, it's sort of a virtuous cycle, and there will be sort of a streamlining accelerationist effect.
Thank you, Nick. I think we've got time for one more quick question. Is there anybody in the audience with a question they would like to ask the panel? We've already done it all. We've obviously given completely conclusive answers to everything we've discussed. That's resounding feedback. Thank you.